Imagine the year 1914. The world is a chessboard of empires, alliances, and tensions. Picture the early 20th century, an era of intense geopolitical rivalry. Mighty nations eyed each other across oceans and continents, their ambitions and fears intertwined in a complex web. The major powers of the day, Britain, France, Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Germany, had carved out vast empires, their influence stretching to every corner of the globe. Their alliances, the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia on one side, and the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary on the other, set the stage for a global conflict of unprecedented scale. The colonial holdings of these powers were not just symbols of prestige, but also potential flashpoints for conflict. In Africa, a continent that had been partitioned among European powers in the infamous Scramble for Africa, these colonial ambitions were especially evident. Germany, a latecomer to the colonial game, held significant territories in Africa, including modern-day Tanzania, then known as German East Africa. The world of 1914 was in many ways a ticking time bomb. The rivalries and tensions between the major powers, fueled by a mix of nationalism, imperialism, and militarism, were simmering just beneath the surface of international relations. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, in June 1914 was the spark that ignited this volatile mix. Yet while the opening shots of what would become known as the Great War were fired in Europe, the conflict quickly spread beyond its borders. And it was in Africa, far from the trenches of the Western Front, that some of the earliest battles of the war were fought. Against this backdrop, the spark of conflict ignites, setting the world ablaze. The first flames, they flicker in East Africa. The date is November 2nd, 1914. The place, Tanga, a port city in German East Africa. As the globe reeled from the outbreak of the First World War, the African continent too found itself embroiled in the conflict. The Battle of Tanga, a pivotal encounter, was the first major clash on African soil. It was here that the British forces, assured of their imminent victory, confronted an unforeseen resistance from the German forces and their African soldiers. The British, armed with their colonial might, anticipated an easy conquest. They arrived on the shores of Tanga with an invasion force of about 8,000 men. Opposing them were the German forces led by Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, a significantly smaller force of about 1,000 men, strengthened by locally recruited askaris, African soldiers hailing from various countries, including Nigeria. The German forces didn't just meet the British with unexpected resistance, but also employed combat techniques they had learned from their African soldiers. This proved to be a key factor in their eventual victory. The strategic importance of Tanga was immense. As a port city, it was a gateway to the heart of German East Africa, today's Tanzania. The British hoped to capture it and cut off Germany's access to the sea, crippling their war efforts in East Africa. The Battle of Tanga, however, did not unfold as the British anticipated. Commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, with his tactical acumen, routed the odds, effectively using the terrain to his advantage and maximizing the effectiveness of his askaris. These African soldiers, often overlooked in the annals of history, fought with exceptional bravery and determination. Their discipline, courage, and familiarity with the local terrain were decisive in repelling the British forces. Despite their numerical superiority, the British were unprepared for the strong resistance they faced. Their attack turned into a hurried retreat with over 700 soldiers killed or wounded. The German forces, on the other hand, suffered only 65 casualties. In the end, the British suffered a humiliating defeat, a foreboding start for the Allies in Africa. The Battle of Tanga was a stark reminder that the First World War was a truly global conflict extending far beyond the familiar battlefields of Europe. In this corner of Africa, the underdogs had claimed the first round. As the war raged on, it wasn't just Europeans fighting on African soil. The Great War, a seemingly distant European conflict, had far-reaching tendrils, pulling in fighters from across the globe. African soldiers from various colonies found themselves thrust into the heart of a war they had no part in starting. The Germans, seeking to bolster their ranks, looked to their colonies in East Africa. These African soldiers, known as askaris, were drawn from various ethnic groups, including the Hehe, Nyamwezi, and Kamba. They served under German officers, fighting bravely despite the foreign nature of this conflict. But the Germans weren't alone in this practice. The Allied forces, too, rallied African soldiers to their cause. From the far reaches of West Africa, Nigeria provided a sizable contingent. These soldiers, many of whom had never left their home region before, found themselves in the steaming jungles and arid plains of East Africa, fighting a war that was as much a battle against the elements as it was against the enemy. The roles these African soldiers played were as varied as their origins. Some served as frontline fighters, facing the horrors of trench warfare and the relentless onslaught of machine gun fire. Others served in auxiliary roles as carriers transporting supplies or as scouts, navigating the treacherous, unfamiliar terrain. Yet for all their contributions, the African soldiers faced immense hardships. They grappled with diseases like malaria and dysentery borne by the harsh African environment. They dealt with racial discrimination, often receiving less pay and poorer treatment than their European counterparts. And when the war ended, many found themselves in a world that had little regard for their service. Despite these challenges, the African soldiers of the Great War fought with courage and determination, their contributions crucial to the war efforts. Their stories, though often overlooked and underrepresented, provide a rich, complex layer to the narrative of World War I. They were more than just footnotes in history. They were and remain an integral part of the World War I narrative. Their stories, often overlooked, are an integral part of the World War I narrative. The guns fell silent in 1918, but the echoes of war resonated long after in Africa. As the world recovered from the horrors of the Great War, East Africa was left to grapple with the aftermath. The war had laid bare the cruel reality of colonialism, and its echoes permeated both the societal and political fabric of the region. The economic strain was palpable. Years of conflict had drained resources, disrupted trade, and ravaged the land. Famine and disease followed in the wake of the war, adding to the toll of human suffering. Yet amidst the hardship, a spirit of resilience emerged. Africans, who had been thrust into a war not of their making, found strength in shared adversity. The war had also brought about unprecedented loss of life. Hundreds of thousands of Africans from different countries, including Nigeria, had been enlisted to fight on foreign soil. Many never returned, their lives claimed by a war waged in the name of empires they had no part in building. This loss was deeply felt, a wound that would take generations to heal. But perhaps the most profound impact of the war was political. The war had highlighted the brutalities of colonial rule, stirring a deep-seated desire for self-determination. The seeds of resistance were sown. In the following decades, these seeds would grow into movements for independence, forever changing the political landscape of Africa. The war also altered the world's perception of Africa. No longer could the continent be seen as a mere pawn in global politics. Africans had shown their courage, their resilience, and their capacity to endure. They had proven themselves to be more than just pawns in the games of great powers. World War I, a conflict sparked in Europe, had lasting repercussions far beyond its borders. So let's take a moment to reflect on the war's impact in East Africa. We've journeyed through a significant slice of history, beginning with the global stage in 1914 and plunging into the First World War conflict on African soil. Remember, this was a war that swept across continents, touching even the most remote corners of the world. East Africa was no exception. The opening battle in this region wasn't just a footnote in the annals of history, it was a pivotal moment that set the stage for a war that would be fought across vast savannas, dense jungles, and towering mountains. The African soldiers who fought in this war played a critical role. They were not merely pawns on a European chessboard, but men with their own dreams, hopes, and fears. These soldiers came from different countries, including Nigeria, and were drafted into the German forces. Their contributions, their bravery, and their sacrifices should never be overlooked or forgotten. They were a testament to the resilience and courage of the African people. In the aftermath of the war, East Africa was left with a legacy that still resonates today. The war brought changes, some immediate, some gradual. It altered political landscapes, shifted boundaries, and transformed societies, but it also left scars. Scars of lost lives, devastated communities, and a generation that had to rebuild from the ashes. Reflecting on this, it becomes apparent how important it is to remember this often overlooked aspect of World War I. It's a reminder that history is not just about dates and battles, but about people, their experiences, and the world they shaped. It's about understanding how events on a global scale can impact communities thousands of miles away. When we remember the Great War, let's also remember the battles fought and the lives lived and lost on the African continent.